Professor Snyder, how is Donald Trump's second presidency so far different from his first term in office?
There are, I think, three major differences. The first is that this time around, President Trump is animated by a sense of vengeance. He wants to make sure that everyone who made his life difficult the first time around is now going to be punished. The second difference is that this time around, we are all functioning inside a big lie. Trump's claim is that he never lost the 2020 election, and accepting that lie and living within that lie now becomes a loyalty test. And the third big difference is that this time they have a plan. In 2016, Trump did not think he was going to win. They had no plan. This time around, they do have a plan, and they're executing the plan. And the plan chiefly has to do with weakening the federal government, making the federal government dysfunctional, except in a few ways which have to do with oppressing the population.
Trump's supporters would argue that everything he's doing was already promised during the campaign and that he received a clear mandate to do it, not only in the presidential election but also in both houses of Congress. They say Trump is doing exactly what he was elected for.
So ever fewer of his supporters, I think, would actually say that. If you look at the opinion polling in the United States right now, Trump is at historically low levels. He's under 40% approval. So it's true that he has hardcore supporters who still are on his side, but for the most part, his policies, even those on the critical issues like immigration and the economy, which, as you quite rightly say, are the issues on which he was elected, he's now not very popular on precisely those issues. So there's no question as to the legitimacy of his election this time around. He won. The question, though, would be, are his policies actually popular? I'd say they're not. And in a month, when the real effects of the tariffs hit, they'll be even less popular. And the other question is, now that he's inside the government, what is he doing to transform the government to make it less democratic and less observant of the rule of law?
Most observers would agree that Trump rules like an autocrat. But you called Trump recently in an interview with Süddeutsche Zeitung even a fascist. As most historians do, others condemn this judgment. How would you justify this harsh term fascism?
I think it's actually pretty uncontroversial. I mean, if a fascist is someone who puts will over reason, if he's someone who believes in a cult of the leader rather than in institutions or laws, if he's someone who puts forth big lies or what we now call alternative realities, if he's someone who governs by way of us versus them, if he's someone who organizes spectacles, for example, seizing people by unmarked secret police in the light of day, then Trump fulfills all of those criteria. I don't know of any definition of fascism, honestly, in which he doesn't fulfill all the criteria. But less important than the word is what I think fascism means for politics, which is fascism calls for a broad coalition. It calls for people to act urgently and in cooperation with others with whom they might otherwise not be in contact. And so I think that the word is correct, but I also think it's refreshing because it reminds people that they have to do things they wouldn't ordinarily do.
When more than 200 years ago the founding fathers wrote the US Constitution, the most important goal was to establish a republic without a king or any kind of autocratic ruler and to prevent any form of tyranny. Why do these checks and balances in the Constitution seem not to be working as they were intended to?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question, and I thank you for it, because if you read the Declaration of Independence today, it's striking how many of the complaints that the American colonists had in the 1770s are repeating themselves today. For example, taxation without representation, or tariffs, or even being seized and taken to a foreign country and imprisoned there. These are all the things that Americans were rebelling against. And of course, you're quite right to say that our Constitution was meant to set up a system of checks and balances. I think the problems are, number one, the Constitution is not really designed for someone who is operating in complete bad faith, which is what we have now. Number two, the Congress, which is meant to be a check, is of the same party as the president. And that party has itself been purged and filtered by the president's actions, including threatening violence to members of his own party for the last 8 years. So the party, the Congress, is not providing much of a check. The courts are providing something of a check, I think, because members of courts, judges, understand that if they don't act now, they will soon become irrelevant. But your general point, I think, is very well taken. The Constitution on its own, despite its age and despite the faith that Americans place in it, will not stop the problem of tyranny. It will only be people acting creatively, not only in politics, but in the broader society, that will defend the republic.
Jetzt haben Sie die Republikanische Partei gerade angesprochen.
You already mentioned the Republican Party. However, it is hard to understand why all Republican congressmen and senators, without any exception, are going along with all this, confirming cabinet members who are grotesquely unqualified and publicly praise the president in a way that would probably even embarrass the dictator in North Korea.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, and it's a pleasure to talk to journalists such as yourself from other countries, because the clarity of the questions reflects the reality in which Americans have to live. Part of our problem and part of the answer to your question is that we are constantly making excuses for ourselves. We're constantly normalizing the situation. The media is constantly looking for some kind of more rational or more appealing justification for what Trump is doing than actually exists. That's part of the problem. With the Republicans, as I've said, part of the problem is that they are afraid of Trump. And not just in the narrow sense that they're afraid that they won't be reelected if they oppose him, but also, I'm afraid, in a much more traditional sense, which is that Trump uses stochastic violence. Trump will use the media, social media, to try to target Republicans who disagree with him. He's been doing that for years, so he has a much tamer party. So we have two problems. We have the problem of American exceptionalism. We think that somehow everything is going to take care of itself because we're America, which is obviously not true. And we have the problem of a tamed and coerced party.
Trotzdem gibt es ja nach wie vor
But there are still important and serious media who report very critically on Trump. Does that not matter at all?
Yes, and perhaps more of a role than reaches the media, whether domestically or abroad. We had 2 rounds of protests in the month of April, which involved millions of people. Because we have too little local news, there's not enough film of this, but it happened. We have several Democratic representatives and senators who have done an excellent job going beyond their own districts out into the broader country, going into Republican districts and describing the world as it actually is. We have a lot of very intelligent lawyers who are filing lawsuits and slowing a lot of this down. And I think we're now, in the next few weeks, reaching a critical moment where these unpopular policies, especially the tariffs, and especially the deportations. It's important that Americans, although they might say they want to see immigrants deported, when they actually see it, when they actually see the use of violence, they realize that something is wrong. And people are beginning to understand that deporting migrants is a big step towards being able to coerce Americans as well. So there is resistance, both in concepts and in argument, but also in real life on the ground. And I think it's just a matter of time before popular opinion and the Democratic Party start to get closer to one another.
Lassen Sie uns kurz über Außenpolitik.
Let's briefly talk about foreign affairs. Trump has speculated about making Canada the 51st US state, to annex Greenland, to reclaim the Panama Canal, and to turn Gaza into a luxury resort after forcing out 2 million Palestinians. Is this all part of what his advisors call flooding the zone with shit? Or must this be taken seriously? I mean, do you truly consider it conceivable that US troops could invade Canada?
So let's take one step back. This administration is a combination of malignancy and incompetence, and it's sometimes very hard to know where the malignancy stops and the incompetence starts. So they have carried out this huge program of tariffs, and then they've promised that they would renegotiate trade agreements with every country in the world, which is, of course, idiotic. We already had trade agreements. We, the United States, violated all of them. And now we're going to renegotiate each of them in turn, ? And of course, we haven't negotiated a single one yet, not a single one. So one has to take into account that what these people can do is bluff, and they can threaten, and they can destroy things inside the United States. Their ability to make any foreign policy in a meaningful direction is very questionable. So I don't think the direct question is, can they invade other countries? I think just for sheer reasons of incompetence, it would probably be hard. The real question is how countries react to threats. And the Canadian election just gives a very interesting example, the election of yesterday, where Trump, by threatening Canada, radically altered the electoral outcome, and not to his own benefit. The party which was closer to him lost about 30 points as a result of his policies. And the party that was running on a platform of getting Canada together to resist won unexpectedly. So these threats are there to make others surrender. And in domestic politics, this very often works. There's too much surrender inside America. But in foreign policy, it's really not working. It tends to be counterproductive. And I think the key lesson is when he threatens you, he'll take what you give him. But there isn't necessarily anything actually following the threat.
As far as Ukraine is concerned, until a few days ago, it looked as if Trump would more or less give it away to Vladimir Putin. But now he has publicly criticized Putin for the first time. Do you think this is some kind of turning point or just a short-term temper tantrum because Trump didn't immediately get what he wanted?
The fundamental reality here is that United States arms deliveries to Ukraine will run out in 2 weeks, and Russia continues to invade Ukraine. That's the fundamental reality. All of this talk of a peace plan is essentially a distraction from that. If Mr. Trump wanted Russia to negotiate seriously, he would have to put pressure on Russia. There has been no American policy under Trump in that direction. There have only been policies to pressure the Ukrainians. So I'm afraid that Mr. Trump every few weeks will say something along the lines of what you've just cited about how he's irritated with Russia. But until the United States has a policy designed to pressure Russia, then none of these remarks from the president make any difference. The basic American policy, unfortunately, is to let our arms supplies to Ukraine run out and then see what happens.
But what is Trump's goal with Ukraine?
It's very hard to say, of course, but I can tell you what we can rule out. Number one, we can rule out any concern about Ukrainian interests, but we can also rule out any concern for American strategic interests. There is nothing in this administration which suggests they have any notion of what an American national interest would be. I think Mr. Trump would be very happy personally to be able to claim the credit for a peace agreement. I think he'd be very happy to be recognized for that personally. But the fact that he doesn't have a notion of what the Russians want or what the Ukrainians are defending makes it very hard for him to get to that point.
Now, you said within the next few weeks there could be a critical point in time and public opinion could turn against Trump. But what will happen then? Are you more of an optimist or a pessimist?
Well, I'm not an optimist or a pessimist. I'm a historian, and a historian knows that the things that are going to happen are generally not the same things that we anticipate happening. And so I would just say very generally, public opinion has already turned against Mr. Trump. His ratings right now, after 100 days, are lower than those of any other president since we've started keeping this measure. And I think he will become still more unpopular in a month when the actual effects of tariffs start to hit home. What I expect to see is more protest. What I expect to see is more Democratic politicians who take up the more radical language of the protesters. And what I hope to see is an overall turn in public opinion where people are not just reacting negatively, but are starting to talk about what kind of America they want to see. So far, what Trump has been able to do is define what he's doing as somehow having to do with the United States. It doesn't. It has to do with him. It has to do with his family. It has to do with a few friends at home and around the world who he wishes to see benefit. I think the big turn comes when people realize none of this has anything to do with the United States. None of this has anything to do with American interests. It just has to do with a few oligarchs. I think that's the big turn that still has to be made. But I wouldn't be surprised if by July and August, what I've just said now is going to sound like absolute common sense in the United States.
If all of this is happening, will any of it impress or influence Mr. Trump and his policies?
It can, yes. Protest does affect things, and overall public opinion does affect things because Trump is still restrained by law. They've done things that are illegal. They've expressed their contempt for judges, but they have not yet said we are governing without law. They have not yet declared that they're a dictatorship or that there's martial law or a state of exception. And that would be a big step for them. It would be very unpopular. It's unclear if much of the federal government would actually accept that kind of declaration. So long as law matters, public opinion and protest matters, because those things affect the overall atmosphere in which judicial decisions are made. It's also the case that a lot of this has to do with confidence. Right now, inside the Trump camp, there's still a great deal of confidence. It's limited to that immediate milieu. But as the economy crashes, he loses more and more people, and he's stuck with an ever smaller circle of people around him. It is harder to make bold, aggressive, dangerous decisions in that circumstance. So yes, I really do think that it matters. They started out really fast. They are now being forced to slow down as they meet resistance from courts, as they meet resistance from other countries, and as more slowly, but I think with ever greater significance, as they meet resistance from inside the United States. It's slowing them down. But as I say, the crucial thing is not slowing them down. The crucial thing is people coming up with a message about what a better America would be. And I think we're still a few months away from that.
But in your interview with Süddeutsche Zeitung a few days ago, you didn't even rule out a civic war that sounded rather terrifying. What did you mean by that?
Oh, well, I mean, Bürgerkrieg was, I think, the headliner's choice of words and not mine. But I'll tell you very precisely what I mean, or what I'm concerned about. What I'm concerned about is the contradiction between destroying the federal government from within, making it less functional by firing civil servants, making it less functional by getting rid of the most important programs having to do with consumer protection, workers' rights, health, and so on, destroying the basic functions of the federal government, while at the same time sharpening the functions of the federal government that have to do with oppression, which have to do with rounding people up, which have to do with deporting people. That's a contradiction, because in the long run, and maybe even in the short run, Americans are going to have to ask themselves, what is the point of having a federal government which is incapable of doing anything except oppressing us? And that question can then be asked at the level of the state. If you're California, or if you're Massachusetts or New York or another rich state which has a Democratic majority, at some point you can't help but ask the question, why are we paying all this taxes to this entity which is delivering nothing in return except arresting people, threatening people, fomenting violence? Now, we're not there yet. The scenario I'm describing is quite a while away. I'm just pointing to the logic of it. In general, people are concerned, will there be an overall regime change in the US towards autocracy, to use your word? And I accept that that's a real possibility, and I'm worried about that too. But there's another possibility, which is that the attempt to create autocratic rule from Washington, D.C. leads to the system buckling, that leads to the country breaking rather than the country yielding to that.
Let me ask a personal question, because many of our viewers seem to care about it. There were media reports that you and your wife, a renowned historian herself, emigrated from the US to Canada because of Donald Trump, that you basically went into political exile, but I understand that's actually not the case.
No, that's not true at all. I was really hoping that Trump would lose when we moved to Canada a year ago. But now that Trump has won, I have to be engaged politically and have the kinds of conversations that we're having now. But no, I was already in Canada. We left for Canada during the Biden administration. The decision had to do with very attractive possibilities at the University of Toronto and other family and personal things that had nothing whatsoever to do with fleeing Trump. And now that Trump is president, I have to be active. I've been in Ukraine twice since then. I've been all over the United States since then, giving lectures, talking about politics, which is what I now feel like I have to be doing.
Lassen Sie uns zum Abschluss.
In closing, let's look ahead to the spring of 2029, 6 months after the next presidential election. I know you're a historian, but I'll ask you anyway. Who will then be governing the United States?
I don't mean to sound evasive, but I think it's very premature to ask that question. What I would say is the people on the Democratic side who will be running are very likely people we haven't heard of yet, or people who are young. I think the Democratic Party is going through a generational change. And on the Republican side, the issue is much more dramatic or tragic, right? Because Trump wants to be their candidate one more time. And in my view, Trump wants to stay in power indefinitely. He wants to stay in power until he dies. And most Republican voters actually don't want that. And if the Republican Party wants to be at all a party and not just a personality cult, they have to oppose that. So between now and 2029, two things are going to happen. Democrats are going to emerge who meet the moment, who are popular in protest situations, and the Republicans are going to have to go through some kind of internal purge, which I think will take place as Trump's policies show themselves to be failures, which is a process I think which is already underway. So too much is going to happen between now and then. What I would assure you, though, is that it's not the question you've asked isn't a normal question. Between now and the next presidential elections, many abnormal things are going to happen, and many good things are going to happen just to make sure we get to normal elections in 2 years and in 4 years.
Apart from Trump's personal desires, is it thinkable that he will be in his third presidency in 4 years' time?
It's certainly thinkable, to use your word, because that kind of thing happens all the time. The main way that you have a regime change in the 21st century is to be elected and to transform the system from within. And in addition to firing civil servants, deporting people after picking them up on the streets, threatening our allies, in addition to all these other things that Trump is doing, they're also trying to figure out ways to make it illegal for him to stay in power. I don't think they're going to succeed, but it is certainly thinkable because that is what Russia did. A lot of things which happen first in Russia tend to happen later in the United States, and they tend to have to do with Mr. Trump. I think Mr. Trump looks at Putin and says, there's a guy who had a couple terms, then he had a couple more terms. Now he seems to be in power forever. I think for Trump personally, that is the model. I think for the country in general, that is probably a breaking point. I think it's not something that Americans would want to accept, including many Americans who personally would vote for Donald Trump.
Professor
Snyder, thank you so much for your time and all the best.
Many thanks. My pleasure.